Nafi Baba Tasavvuf, Tarih ve Kültürel Miras Araştırma Merkezi of this academic year. This is our fifth lecture. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce you Sümeyye Aslıhan Gürbüzel. Dr. Gürbüzel is an assistant professor of Ottoman history at the McGill Institute of Islamic Studies in Montreal. Dr. Gürbüzel graduated from Department of Economics at Bilkent University in 2005 and then changed her discipline during her MA studies. Her MA thesis is on Hamidian policy in Eastern Anatolia, and again at Bilkent University, which she graduated from at 2008. Then she moved backward in periods, the period that she studies, but forward in her career as she completed her PhD studies in history and Middle Eastern studies at Harvard in 2016. Her dissertation is titled Teachers of the Public, Advisors to the Sultan, Preachers and the Rise of a Political Public Sphere in Early Modern Istanbul, 1600 to 1670. After completing her dissertation, she landed safely at Montreal at McGill, where she teaches courses on history of Islam and the Ottoman Empire since then. Dr. Gürbüzel's work focuses on religious movements, Sufism, reading culture and manuscripts, and the ways in which all of these are related to the public sphere in the early modern Ottoman world. Among her published works, I can mention her article on piety, which appeared in the Journal of Early Modern Cultural Studies in 2018, in which she discussed the potential of power of piety in, I quote, challenging and redefining the locus of moral legitimacy and authority in Ottoman public. In another work, Dr. Gürbüzel discusses the editorial renderings of an 18th century Sufi author, İsmail Hakkı Bursevi, as a middle author, and this piece I really enjoyed reading a lot, as a middle author between the original author and the copyist. And she relates this phenomenon of middle authors to deep reading and the emergence of freestanding libraries in the same period. And speaking of libraries, I would like to mention the recent loss of our friend and colleague Yavuz Sezer with deep sorrow. Eğer burada olsaydı, bizimle olsaydı önümüzdeki dönemde kendisini de burada ağırlamak isterdik. Dr. Gürbüzel has a number of works in the pipeline. I just would like to mention the volume titled A Social History of Language in the Ottoman Empire, 1300 to 1800, which he is co-editing with Nir Shafir, and the volume will come out from Edinburgh University Press. More importantly, she is preparing her monograph titled Taming the Messiah, the Formation of an Ottoman Political Public Sphere, and it will come out from California University Press in 2022. Today, Dr. Gürbüzel will deliver her lecture on the languages of heaven, Persianate Islam in the Ottoman Empire, in which she will discuss anti-Puritan writings of early modern Ottoman world and the role of Persian language in them. Before I leave the screen to Dr. Gürbüzel, I would like to remind you that you can share your questions and comments through the chat box. I will direct your questions to our speaker at the end of the talk, with 20 minutes or so, depending on the energy Aslıhan has. And I also would like to thank Fatih for the technical support and assisting me in collecting the questions. Now I leave the floor, or the virtual screen, the mini box, to Aslıhan. Thank you.
Let me begin. Okay. Thank you to everyone for being here today. First of all, for most of you for picking this over a nice spring day, especially in Montreal. And it's an absolute pleasure and honor to be invited to this series at the Boğaziçi Nafi Baba Merkezi. So I'd like to thank my colleagues, Derin Terzioğlu, Zeynep Oktay Uslu, Tolga Jora, and everyone at the Center of Nafi Baba Tasavvuf Merkezi and Boğaziçi University for their kind invitation. I have decided to begin with a story, since it has now become a tradition in the craft of history to begin with these stories. And I'll begin with a story that will hopefully set the scene for us for our discussion. So what you see in the image is a sema ceremony or a Sufi ceremony. I will use the word sema a lot to refer to the musical and bodily movements of the dervishes as a ritual form. What you see here is the sema ceremony at the Konya Mevlevi Lodge in the year 1578. When the Ottoman army going on a campaign to the east visits the Konya Mevlevi Lodge, attends a sema ceremony, and in fact, in the leadership of the sheikh of the lodge, known as the Çelebi, also performs a divination from the Mesnevi, so sort of a bibliomancy, to be able to guess the outcome of the Eastern campaign. And this is pretty much an Ottoman imperial tradition to make this ritual stop at the Konya Mevlevi Lodge on the campaigns to the east. The story I have is set in the same place, but it is set in the time of Murad IV, 1638, when Murad IV is going set out on a military campaign to the east. His goal was not only to conquer Baghdad in this case, but also bring the title or claim the title of Ghazi, since the Ottoman sultans had long been criticized for not holding up to the glorious military reputation of their forefathers. The stakes were high. For moral support, Murad IV, the sultan, asked a famed preacher of the Hagia Sophia Mosque, Kadızade Mehmet, to accompany him on the campaign. When the duo arrives at the Konya Mevlevi Lodge, a disagreement arose. The Sultan's chosen preacher, Kadızade, had established a reputation for his fierce opposition to the practice of sema. He saw this ritual as an illicit innovation and as a despicable corruption of the prophetic tradition and legacy. So after years of denouncing Sema at the pulpit in Hagia Sophia and other mosques, according to the story, Kadızade is now asked to participate in this very Sema by the Sultan. He did not oblige. So furious at the preacher's irreconcilable liberty, sorry for my morning enunciation, Murad IV sent a messenger to the preacher and ordered him to attend the performance of Mevlevi music, Ney Kudum. Otherwise, the Sultan said, I will either break his leg or make him a cook at this lodge. So in an effort to pass the full force of the command, the Kadızade Mehmet, the Sultan's messengers hit the preacher so hard that he was injured and had to go back to Istanbul, where he subsequently died for the crime of offending the Mevlevi saints. So this is a story, and from the beginning I will say it is an inaccurate story. First of all, Kadızade Mehmet had been dead at the time of the campaign, and there are other twists in the story. But it is a typical narrative of a range of Ottoman narratives that I will be speaking about today under the rubric of anti-Puritan literature. Many of these narratives, such as the one I just summarized, rewrote these Kadızadeli debates, these Puritan debates, by downplaying the tension between the ruling elite and the Sufi orders in the 17th century. Instead, these narratives portrayed the movement as an unfortunate episode caused by these hostile preachers, and from which the Sufi orders ultimately emerged triumphant. So the purpose of the talk is to start a conversation on Ottoman anti-Puritanism, namely a range of Ottoman authors, often connected through social or Sufi networks or textual connections, who define their version of Islam as an antidote to and in clear contradistinction to the Kadızadeli movement of the 17th century. Founding hagiographies, biographical literature, tezkires, mystical commentaries, and polemical treatises, this literature portrays Kadızadelis as troublemakers, deniers of saints, violators of Ottoman and Islamic tradition, both of those things, and even as heretics, mulhid and munkir. While the Puritan Kadızadeli movement, a Sharia-minded reform movement that spanned the first 3/4 of the century, is well known even to non-specialists and non-Ottomanists, we tend to neglect the response and resistance to this Puritan movement, which was spearheaded by Sufi networks. And even though dissenting individuals have been studied in depth, for instance, Derin Terzioğlu's close study on Niyazi Mısri is an example, and the many studies on Abdülgani Nablusi, the Damascene Sufi, about which I will talk about later, is another example. Although we know about these dissenting individuals, they are studied in isolation rather than as part of a collective intellectual and cultural milieu. So instead of this approach, I will today try to present these various voices as connected efforts to challenge the religio-political vision of the Kadızadeli period. As shown in recent studies by Derin Terzioğlu, Tiana Kristic, and lately by Tezcan, the Puritan tendencies of the period are best understood within the long-term history of Ottoman Sunnitization. In this long-term trend, Ottoman imperial legitimacy and justification of social disciplining efforts crystallized in greater official involvement in the imposition of correct Sunni doctrine. What remains underexplored, however, is the strong early modern opposition to this religio-political synthesis. And more importantly for today's talk, this synthesis encroached first and foremost upon a realm of authority traditionally held by Sufi orders and local networks of piety. Paying attention to the reactions and resistance as expressed in this literature paves the way to trace the processes of negotiation between Ottoman state and society, and the important role that non-state networks, such as the Sufi networks that I describe here, played in the negotiations of the boundaries of state religion. So this is a term that I will be using, state religion, and by the term state religion, I will refer to the intervention of legal or imperial authorities into religious practice. So I will use it in this very specific sense of the combination of belief and enforcement rather than, in a general sense of the religious tendencies of the dynasty. And as you will see today, I argue that during this period, it was not only correct doctrine, but the right of the authorities to impose correct doctrine, that was the topic of large-scale debate. So in addition to looking close up to this notion of enforcement, I will draw attention to the longevity of the Ottoman anti-Puritan literature. The reading, writing, rewriting of anti-Puritan works continued well after the official end of the movement in 1683 into the early 19th century, especially the time of Selim III and after. The Ottoman afterlives of the Kadızadeli debate suggests that rather than viewing these debates as a historical event with a finite end, these discussions should be considered as paradigmatic discussions on the nature of Ottoman Islam and on religious authority. So by drawing attention to the afterlife of the debates, where they continue to serve in a paradigmatic capacity, I'd like to draw attention to the gradual formation of a canon of Ottoman religious thought in this period that, although referring to classical and formative ideas, was fundamentally grounded in the anti-Puritan literature and the specific context of the early modern age. One last sort of general concern before I go in the material is that I define anti-Puritanism as a long-term, broad-ranging trend, and I acknowledge there are different strands within this anti-Puritan trend. In the broader study, I have identified two kinds of oppositions. One is more legalistic, and the other one is what I call Persianate, and I'll explain why I use that term. These two trends share end goals, but diverge on means and methodologies. As my title suggests, I'll focus more on the Persianate. Islam is housed in, is found in the early modern Mevlevi order. The Mevlevis were, to begin with, one of the two Sufi orders explicitly targeted by the Kadizadeli preachers. And at one point by the Sheikh al-Islam himself, and they were one of the two orders alongside Helvetes. Therefore, from the first wave of the movement in the 1620s onward, the Mevlevis produced some of the most widely read rebuttals of the spiritual version of Islam. So in the first part of the talk, I'll do a close reading of one of these treatises that show the Mevlevi vision of what is wrong with the Puritan trend in Islam. And in the second part, I'll talk about the afterlives of the literature produced here. So if you have ever heard me speak, you know that I am always just short of saying Ankaravi. So I will begin by speaking about the writings of Ismail Ankaravi, who was, according to the Mevlevi tradition and other contemporary sources, such as Evliya Çelebi, the nemesis of Kadizade Mehmet, one of the many. And at the time, he was the sheikh of the Galata Mevlevi Lodge. Oh my God, so slow. So he was praised as a hero in a very military language, as a Ghazi against the Kadizadelis. He wrote direct responses to Kadizade Mehmet and other preachers. And he often accused Kadizade of heresy, according to Katip Çelebi. So one of the most sort of succinct statements of Ankaravi's arguments against the Puritan Islam that I'll focus on today is his commentary on 40 prophetic sayings. The commentary, there are many versions of prophetic sayings in here, but from the beginning he says, this collection is meant as a rebuttal of the attacks against the Mevlevis. And from the beginning, he defines two questions that are at the heart of the criticism of the Mevlevis. One of them is the claim that Persian is the language of hell, and somehow this is mobilized against Mevlevis. And the other one is the question of illicit innovations, or innovations bid'ah question in general, and Mevlevis are criticized for accommodating innovations a little too freely. So in his mind, and I think this gives us an opportunity to look at it from the other side, in his mind, these are the two main issues, and everything else, such as the Sema question, the other specific innovations are then added to these two main questions. So let's begin with the claim that Persian is the language of hell. In this specific context, what did that mean? Unfortunately, Ankaravi does not really articulate the sources that make this claim. He refers to a legal manual, which was also used as a primer in schools at this period, Shiratul Islam, and on the screen you see a Turkish version which explicitly was noted, was translated to be taught at a primary school. So one of the sources is this, in a 12th century Hanifi manual, in which there is a section on Persian, but people are discouraged from learning Persian because they learn it for social distinction and it obstructs their study of religious sources. But luckily, this is not the only reference to Persian and the question of the language of afterlife. As Dirin Tarzanoğlu has noted in her study of Nusi Nasihi, another Haviti preacher of the period, the Nasihatname tradition, or in this period, often condemned city folk who were fond of nothing but Persian poetry. Similarly, much later, the Naqshbandi Sheikh Murad Buhari, now we're mid-19th century, who was criticized by a preacher of his time who considered Buhari a fanatic Puritan, Kaba Sufu, whom Buhari considered a fanatic Puritan. He criticizes Naqshbandi Sheikh for teaching Kızılbaş books. On the slide, you see the Darul Mesnevi that Buhari established in 1844. The books he taught here were the Mesnevi, Penname by Attar, and more contemporary Persian poetry such as Sahibi Tebrizi. So the description of Persian as the language of the Kızılbaş appears as rhetorical libel that was commonly employed in similar disagreements over the Persianate canon. For instance, one last example, chronologically in between these two examples, is Fazlazade Ali, a Puritan-leaning author studied by Marleyan Kurtz, who heavily criticized Sufis for prioritizing Persian books. Fazlazade wrote that the divergence of Istanbul's people from Sharia began in the year 1000 when books written in the language of the Kızılbaş became widespread in the Ottoman Empire. He complained of Sufis who memorized the Mesnevi, taking its verses for mystical wisdom, and he retorted, mystical wisdom is obedience to God, irfan itaattir, not learning poems and verses and conversing about Sufism. So what is noteworthy in these remarks is that in modern scholarship, Persian literature is often treated as a sort of secular aspect of Islamic canon. Translating Persian adab as secular is an entrenched scholarly practice, almost reflex. On the other hand, as we can see from Fazlazade's remarks and the kind of texts that are being criticized here, early modern readers often read the Persian canon, especially the Mesnevi, as mystical wisdom, therefore ascribing to it moral and divine authority. And when this divine authority is ascribed, we do have the clash. In other words, the main argument, the main question in this argument over Persian as a language of hell seems to be from Ankaravi's treatment and this sort of contemporary notes is the boundaries of religious canon. Which corpus has moral authority and which corpus does not? For the case of the Mesnevi, the question is very clearly, is Rumi's book a Persian Quran or is it Sharia violating poetry? I have used this miniature from a 16th century Mevlevi source on the poster. This miniature is very much about the divine status of Rumi's Mesnevi. What happens here is Rumi's disciple, Hüsam Çelebi, has a dream in which the prophet himself reads the Mesnevi and approves of it. The sort of notion that the Mesnevi is approved by the prophet, even though the wording is very much different, of course, from the Quran and Hadith. Or another miniature in the same series shows the Mesnevi emerging from the secrets that God entrusted to Muhammad during the ascension. So there is that notion of the divine origins of the Mesnevi that we see repeatedly in the Mevlevi tradition, but also in non-Mevlevi readers of the Mesnevi. So the notion of a direct communication between Rumi and the Prophet was, at the basis of the broadly shared conception that the Mesnevi was the inner meaning of the Quran, Ma'az the Quran. This was a cornerstone of the teachings of the Mevlevi order, including Ankaravi. Most remarkably, he wrote a work called Gather of Verses, Jami'ul Ayat. It's a compendium of all references to the Quran found in the 6 volumes of the Mesnevi. Some are direct quotes, but others have no common wording. They are posed as the sort of exposition of the inner meaning of the verses. There is also a more rational philosophical discussion on the nature of revelation that this is relevant to, but I don't want to get into that. I'm happy to do that later. In this discussion of the Mesnevi and its relationship with the sacred status of Persian, Ankaravi concludes by saying that the Mesnevi, first and foremost, was the book that made Persian a language of heaven. Quote, he says, the noble Mesnevi was written in Persian, that the noble Mesnevi was written in Persian gave this language an additional badge of honor and carried the rank of poetry to an exalted status. For the Mevlevi tradition, the sort of revelation, the connection between revelation and Mesnevi is very clear, but we also learn from Ankaravi's work that in this period, some preachers do preach against the content of the Mesnevi in the pulpits. So this is a page from Kadızade Mehmet, in which he argues that the Quran's wording and only the Quran's wording should be used in any kind of religious ritual. And he does include at the end of this work a fatwa from Ebu Suud Efendi to the same effect. So this is as much as Kadızade Mehmet himself writes, although we don't know the works of Kadızade so much. But we have other manuscript sources that are written by anonymous preachers, along the same Kadızade League, that have given fatwas about the performance of the Mesnevi. And the word performance is really important, although I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk about that separately. I will be talking about different kinds of performances. And Mesnevi is a text that we should consider in the context of a performance, because there is a tendency to assume that because this book is in Persian, it is only read by commentators and it is only read in like higher educated circles. But we do know that study circles for the Mesnevi were formed at mosques, and we have evidence of this happening in imperial mosques, at the Grand Mosque of Medina, and a few other important mosques in great cities. So these fatwas are against the performance of this work. So for instance, one of the fatwas is question what is necessary by Sharia to those who recite couplets and poems during ritual gatherings. The answer is renewal of faith. Another one cites from the Mesnevi, although not stating that it is from the Mesnevi, and says it is not permissible for those dancers to liken themselves to the angels circumnavigating the heavens. It is not permissible for them to liken themselves to the pilgrims circumnavigating the Kaaba. These are direct lifts from the Mesnevi when the Sufis who are performing the Sema are likened to angels and to the pilgrims circumambulating the Kaaba. There's an interesting question here, which would be nice to speculate about, which is, what makes this literature problematic? Is it the content or is it the Ottoman reception of it? For me, I try to ground this discussion very much in the commentary tradition as much as I can, and manuscript tradition in which we can see the reactions to the Mesnevi. And what we see in this sort of fatwas and sermons is that there is a reaction against the incomparability of Mesnevi, incommensurability of Mesnevi with Sharia, both against its content and against its ritual uses. Okay. So when he responds to, where am I? Okay. When he responds to these claims that the Mesnevi is not compliant with Sharia, Ankaravi's response is really interesting, and I'll give it a few minutes. Usually what we see in the sort of defensive literature produced during the Kadızadeli movement is to show that indeed a certain practice is legal. So if sema is being attacked, to show that sema is indeed legal. What he does here is to say that the Mesnevi is not, does not conform to the legal standards, but it doesn't mean that it contradicts what he calls the science of afterlife. This is a Ghazalian term that he takes from Ghazali, and to make a distinction between what you see on the screen, the science of afterlife, which I'm translating as religion, and the science of jurisprudence, which Ankaravi translates as ilm al-fetwa. So what Ghazali is doing here is to differentiate between religion as a broader field versus Sharia and the legal discourse, which is sort of as a subset of that broader discourse. And what Ankaravi is doing in his way of appropriating this is to say that, yes, this isn't compliant with Sharia, maybe, or he doesn't explicitly say that, but he says that Mesnevi should be considered as part of the science of afterlife. And then he goes on to say how important Mesnevi is for moral improvement. So the force of the argument is that he is trying to find another framework that is trying to replace the sort of very Sharia-centered and Sharia-focused discourse of the Kadızadelis. And for this, he is going back to Ghazali and adopting this larger term of the science of afterlife as an alternative to Sharia, which has more legal connotations. And from this moment, he goes on to saying Mesnevi should not be judged by Sharia because it's a book of hikmah, which means philosophical. Sufism in this case, I mean, it literally means philosophy, but the way he's using is philosophical Sufism. So this kind of argument by saying, you know, this isn't a book of Sharia, it should not be judged by Sharia, and therefore defining a space that is constructed by non-legal discourses, but still part of this larger religious field, is a theme that we see in other sources in the 17th century. Most significantly, Katip Çelebi, for instance, makes the same argument in his Balance of Truth when he's discussing the issue of the legitimacy of music. He says, from time immemorial, yes, people of Sharia have disagreed with music, but people of Hikmah have considered it as useful, and we will never reconcile these two frames. They will continue to coexist. So this is what I mean when I say that for Ankaravi, Persian was symbolic of this notion of the authority of non-legal discourses within the Islamic tradition, at least in the way that he analyzes that, and he sort of positions that against ilm al-fetwa and other legal sciences. The last thing I want to say about this debate on the language of heaven is, as I suggested at the beginning, in the way Ankaravi constructs this question of the language of heaven is very much related to the other burning question of the period, which is the question of innovations. Are all innovations illicit? Which is, of course, a discursive strategy that we do see in Puritan preaching at this time. Against this notion of illicit innovations, Ankaravi comes up, he doesn't come up with it, it goes to Nevevi, but he does forcefully argue that this isn't the right way to analyze innovations. And in fact, there is a five-partite classification of innovations that we should go back to, and this is followed in the people I will be talking about in a bit. So the five-partite classification, I won't go into the details, but interesting thing about this classification is that on the top of the category, you see necessary innovations. These include theology as a science, or ilm al-hadith, the science of collecting the Prophet's sayings. And in the commendable innovations you see, for instance, madrasas. And Ankaravi's argument is that these are all, if we are talking about practices emerging after the time of Salaf, these are all practices that emerged after that initial early Islamic period, but they are integral parts of Islam. So what he is trying to do is a little bit different, although related to the kind of justifications. We do see theoretical justifications in literature, which are usually based on the benefit of innovation for the society. For instance, he's trying to come up with a more comprehensive understanding of innovations and Islamic tradition, for which he uses the word sunnah in a more capacious sense, in which there is an ongoing process of accumulation of new forms of knowledge. And Persian, again, is seen as the epitome of this type of tradition that is a latecomer to Islam, but that is an integral part of the ethical formation of a Muslim, and that's an integral part of knowledge in the Islamic sense. So I was trying to keep this shorter, but I got carried away. But I just want to say that the reason the Ottoman incarnation of the language of heaven and Persian is worth attention is that the discussions on language are very much related to different conceptions of history and tradition, and what belongs in a tradition and what does not. So Persian seems to be a shorthand for these type of debates in this case. To refer to, I will talk about the practical implications of this and the Ghazalian frame in the second part, but I want to sort of pause 5 minutes and to say a few things about my choice of the word Persianate to describe this sort of self-avowedly distinct interpretation of Islam. After I sip my water. So this is something I'm happy to talk at greater length later on, but something I wanted to mention is that Persianate is a term that is popular and getting more popular, and it is almost always used in a certain sense of connectivity. So Shahab Ahmed uses, or doesn't use it, but refers to Balkans, to Bengal complex in his introduction to the volume, The Persianate World. Niall Green uses the phrase from Britain to China to sort of cover this land of connectivity, cultural scape of connectivity, and Persianate is often used in this sort of large-scale land, and it has relevance in that sense. For instance, I will talk about the impact of Indian Sufism in the second part, and of course there this sort of framework of connectivity is very important, but what I'm trying to do here is a little bit different in that I try to look at the local meaning of this sort of canon and this cultural corpus rather than looking at it as a sign of connectivity, and I think there is space to do that based on this discussion that I just summarized here. I have made the choice to translate Ajam or Farsi as Persianate because the discussion on Persian is very much then transferred to the discussion on the authority of Turkish and the early Islamic literature that was around the discussion of the authority of Turkish was established the basis of similar discussions on the authority of, say, Turkish recitation. And this is another sort of trend, the connectivity of these Persianate and Turkish questions that I can see beginning with Ankaravi all the way to Sheikh Galib, for instance, who also speaks about similar issues of the language of revelation. Okay, I'm pretty sure I forgot one point here, but I can come back to the Persian question later. In the second part, I want to talk about the sort of long-term reception of the kind of literature that is produced in the first half of the 17th century in opposition to the Kadızades. So as I said in the beginning, one of the main homes of this literature is Mevlevi sources. The interesting thing about Mevlevi sources is that we don't have a collection of Ottoman Mevlevi biographies until the early 18th century, which is half a century after all of these debates are settled. And this is the first expression of a Mevlevi identity as it crystallized in the 18th century. Is Sakıp Dede's Sefine-i Nefise-i Mevleviyan collection of Mevlevi biographies. It's an interesting source because you can see the crafting of a new identity by changing some of the older narratives. For instance, the narrative that I began with about Sultan Murad, what really happens there is a conflict between the Konya Çelebi's and Murad over endowment property. But it's rewritten as this sort of Kadızadeli stirred injustice. There are other forms of rewriting. For instance, the early Shiite-leaning Mevlevis are sort of habilitated to become more Sunni. And one of the other aspects of this sort of crafting of a Mevlevi identity is emphasizing the sort of valiant fight that the Mevlevis put forward in the age of Kadızadeli. So Ankaravi is very much portrayed as one of these heroes. Another person, the famous Müneccimbaşı Ahmet Dede, who was a historian and a chief astrologer to Mehmet IV, he is described as, quote, just as Rusuhi Dede İsmail Ankaravi was the head of the defense against the Kadızadelis in his day, Müneccimbaşı Ahmet Dede was as if appointed by the saints against that cunning Vani. He tied the tongue of the reprehensible slanderer and his unwashed followers in their denials and received many praises and prayers from the dervishes. So there are these narratives about 17th century figures as warriors against the Kadızadelis. There are multiple stories about lesser Mevlevis figures who defend people against judges who are too harsh. There is one, for instance, who is defending a person because who is being persecuted by the Shahid for Shahid Bazi for watching beautiful boys. And even figures like some of the disciples of Ankaravi who do not go on to become major sheikhs, they are simply disciples of Ankaravi, and they copied out and distributed his treatises during the Kadızadeli debates. This is one of the Mecmuas, or one such disciple who wrote out multiple copies of Ankaravi's treatises and sent those out to mosque preachers. So even pupils like him are praised for their fortitude and for their service against Kadızadeli, against the Kadızadeli movement, which is something that is very much present in Sakıp Dede, and then later on the subsequent Mevlevi histories, such as Esrar Dede. So, what I want to come back to is sort of the long-term reception of the movement, and I will try to summarize that by referring to this diagram I made with basic paint, sorry. And I would like to point out to the textual connections from the early days of the Kadızadeli movement, well, until the end of the 18th century to Sheikh Galip, and there are also similar sources from the early 19th century. By focusing on one work of Abdülgani and Nablusi, I will be brief. Nablusi's work is called Defense of Mevlevi Masters, or The String of Pearls in the Way of the Mevlevi Masters. He writes that right after the blanket ban on Sema, which was issued in 1666, the number of the beast, to 1684. And this was a blanket ban on Sema, during which the practice of Sema was forbidden by the fatwa of Minkare Zadeh Yahya Effendi. I don't have, it's a very long fatwa, but two things that are interesting about this fatwa is that A, it singles out the Mevlevis. It says the Mevlevi Sema, not Sema. B, it does define it as the Sultan's duty to interfere, to correct religious practice, in this case, to interfere for the eradication of innovation. So what Nablusi does is that he writes multiple tracks during this time of the Sema ban, and one of them is a lengthy treatment of the Sema as a ceremony and defense of the Mevlevis as descendants on Rumi. It is taken up by three different authors. Two of them are Mevlevi Dedes, one of them is Peçevi, but another one is Müstakimzade Süleyman Saadettin, who takes up the work 1 century later and expands it by adding multiple anecdotes about this past event. The question is, why is he taking up this work 1 century later? And his response is that it's because, although this might seem like a work about the Mevlevis, it's actually relevant to all the Muslims of any time. And the relevance sort of unfolds as we read through it, and this period is almost read as a moral story by Müstakimzade and his Naqshbandi network. Before that, I want to emphasize one thing, is that some of the expansions of Müstakimzade add specific Ottoman context. So, for instance, what we see about Ottoman Sunnitization policies is the Ottoman state's efforts to control the socialization at the mosques by separating out the mosque and the lodge. And this has been recently studied by Çiğdem Kafisçioğlu, separating out the mosque and the lodge. The Mevlevis were sometimes at the receiving end of this policy, and by other policies governing the mosques, for instance, by enforcing daily attendance and creating sort of a culture of neighborhood surveillance that enforces this attendance at the mosques. What we see in sort of this 18th century enlarged or expanded version of the Nablusi's treatise on Mevlevis is that there is explicit criticism of these policies of the Ottoman state, such as the policy of forcing daily attendance at the mosques is criticized, and Müstakimzade simply says that the Mevlevi custom, which is sort of a buzzword, is to attend the Friday prayers, and they can't be forced. There is no legal basis to force them for the other times for the mosque. So this is just one example of how in the 18th century renderings, there are explicit references to specific Ottoman practices and then specific opposition to Ottoman practices. Another interesting thing about this 18th century sort of expansions on the 17th century sources is that the Sema is presented as an Ottoman tradition, which actually is explained as part of court ceremony. So according to Müstakimzade, the performance of music at the court is an old adab tradition that goes to Harun Rashid. And here again, we see the sort of similar parallel arguments about the authority of other forms of Islamic traditions. So he says, this is a court tradition at this point that is observed not only at the court, but also in households, vizierial households, pasha households, and therefore it does qualify as an Ottoman tradition. There is that kind of defense, which actually is an important point, because we do know, especially from Cemal Kafadar's article, the Kılıç Kuşanma Törenleri, that despite all of this atmosphere of pressure, the Mevlevis actually became more visible, not less visible, in court ceremony, beginning with the 17th century, and this trend seems to have really taken off by the 18th century. What these specific reactions to specific policies tell for me is that we do know, for instance, that long after these policies of separating mosque and lodge, the mosques continued to be used for Sufi ritual, but rather than seeing those things as sort of remnants of an old tradition, this literature actually suggests that these might be sort of more conscious reactions to these policies of Sunnitization, or of differentiating between a more Sharia-oriented Islam and other forms of Islam. So the last concept that I want to bring on the table before we finish is based on Mehmet Emin Tokadi, whom you see here, who is a Mujaddidi Naqshbandi, which is an important order. The Mujaddidis are followers of Ahmed Sirhindi, who is an Indian sheikh, and Ahmed Sirhindi is rightly being compared to Qadazadeh Mehmet in terms of his discourse that blames moral corruption of Muslims for the political decline of the Islamic world. But one thing that I find interesting is that the early Mujaddidis, at least who are followers of Sirhindi, are very much different from what we see in Sirhindi's works itself. For instance, I'll talk about the Sema ban now, and we do see a few Mujaddidis on the side of the Mevlevis in the Sema debate. The main reason for this could be that the Mujaddidis, did not develop in a vacuum, but they formed connections with Mevlevis and Halvetis initially. For instance, Tokadi, who was one of the first Mujaddidis, was someone who studied music with the Mevlevi, with Atri Effendi, and he was very much in Mevlevi circles and stayed that way. So the importance of this diagram for me is to show the longevity of these textual receptions, but to also point out that although I focus on the Mevlevis, there are other Sufi orders that are very much sharing vocabulary with the Mevlevi literature that I discuss here, especially in the early 18th century. There is a Mevlevi Naqshbandi approachment that we see here, and we see here, which is another defense of the Mevlevi order treatise written by a Naqshbandi sheikh and taken up by Sheikh Galip. So I will just talk about this one last concept that I think drives home the practical relevance of these terms, and then I'll set you free. The concept I want to talk about is the concept of Sulhidi, which might again sound familiar if you have ever looked at the literature on Sirhindi. The term Sulhikul is presented as an early modern Mughal concept that emphasizes sort of accommodation between different versions of Islam, and this is a policy that the Sirhindi line sort of opposed to in India. The reason I'm telling you is that because I see the term Sulh, I decided there might be some sort of connection with Sirhindi. But in fact, Tokadi is writing of Sulhidin, religious accommodation, very much as a remedy to the kind of tensions that the Ottoman society suffered from in the 17th century. He uses Sulhidin, and again, this line of argument of emphasizing the social impacts of these debates is present since Ankaravi includes Nablusi. They both refer to the creation of social tension, tenafur, by the policies of the Ottoman state in this period, and they argue instead for this concept of religious accommodation, which is an important term in Islamic tradition. It does refer to the legal practice of sulh. It does refer to the legal concept of maslaha, but more importantly, it does refer to the principle of public good that these networks are arguing should be prioritized rather than this direct interference as seen in the case of Sema in religious practice. So sulh is an interesting concept that occurs again and again in this anti-Puritan literature, but of course one should understand the exact import and limitations of this term so as not to sort of construct it as a general, liberal state of being. Of course not. There is also a discussion in this literature on the limits of this principle. In other words, where does the principle of public good or sulhidin apply? What I've seen throughout that lineage is three kinds of situations are identified explicitly and repeatedly as situations where the principle of accommodation should be applied. The first one is innovations in the sense of practices that were not explicitly mentioned in the sources as forbidden and that do not have a clear harm to the society. In these issues that are open to legal ijtihad, comment, disagreement is allowed. So Sema is an example of this issue where there is no ban on Sema in the sources, there is no harm to the public, zarar veya fayda. So it should be one of these issues that should be considered a legally private issue in the sense that immune from legal interference. Of course, I'm talking about religious practice here, but most of these practices are applied to other areas of life. For instance, chess playing. The coffee house debate is often discussed in similar terms of this is an innovation, it should be considered an occasion for sulh, which also brings to mind the sort of implications of the earlier debate on or the more theoretical debate on innovations and what kind of practical implications that might have. The second kind of place where sulh is allowed, accommodation is allowed, which means that communities should be allowed to practice in line with their own interpretation rather than the imposition of a standardized sort of principle. So this is the principle of accommodation. The second one, I think I already said it, is issues in which there is no public harm. So the issue with the Sema ban here is, again, there is no argument about public good that accompanies the argument of correct doctrine, which is different from contemporary discussions on coffee and tobacco, for instance, where there is an argument from harm. And the third one is the most interesting. It says, affect is not subject to legal regulations. Vijdani or emotional practices are not subject to legal principles, which is something that is articulated again and again in this sort of literature. So, in conclusion, what I try to portray here in very broad strokes is a group of authors who in the long term define themselves through opposition to the Kadizadeh program. They share a positive theory of innovation, this five-partite division of innovations is something that I found through Ankaravi, Nablusi, Tokadi, all that line. A shared concern for public good, the concept of maslaha and so, and an argument for communal autonomy or limits to state enforcement of religion, the clear to balance that with a certain degree of communal autonomy in chosen issues is one of the themes that we see running through here. So to briefly conclude, I just want to say that while the diversity of Ottoman Islam is recognized as a general phenomenon, more discussion on how to term said diversity is needed. In this talk, I have followed one strand of anti-Puritanism that I see most vocally defended by the Mevlevi order, and argued for the idea of a Persianate Islam as a meaningful way of speaking about such diversity in terms that are grounded, at least in the Mevlevi sources, and then that can be traced in these adjacent sources, such as the early Naqshbandi sources. I have also underlined the social commentary in these seemingly old and theoretical debates, mainly the conception of religious accommodation, based on the notion of certain limitations on enforcement of standardized, all applicable rules of religious conduct. The last thing I want to emphasize is my main takeaway from reading these treatises on the Mesnevi, on the language of heaven, closely has been to think about really the methodology with which we approach our sources and where we draw the line between what counts as literature, what counts as religion, what counts as a source relevant for a debate like this that we have, and how we could benefit a little bit more from looking at the early modern debates into these categorizations and authorities of texts in order to be able to avoid drawing that line artificially between the secular and the religious. So I am going to stop here. Sorry, I went over time a bit.
Thank you, Aslan, very much. Indeed, you spent almost exactly 1 hour. So thank you. So I believe there will be questions from the audience. As I said at the beginning of the talk, you can use the chat box. And through that, I will direct the questions to Aslıhan. And we already piled up some. So let me begin. Would you like to take a minute of break, Aslıhan, to take some water?
I'm sorry?
Are you fine? Can we start taking the questions?
I was taking time, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so Professor Jurdi Abisab has a question, indeed a question and 2 comments. She thanks you for this stimulating talk, and she liked your emphasis on the local meanings. And she would like to know whether in Ankaravi's response to Kadilizade Mehmet, he disengages the Persian language question altogether. Does he ignore it when making the point that the Mesnevi contributes to the science of afterlife? And she has comments. Would you like to take them as well?
Sure, please.
And she thinks that the criticism against teaching Kızılbaş books may point to Shiism more than the Persianate elements. And she has a class tension. She senses a class tension also. Urban upper classes being more prone to projecting an image of Persian poetry. Okay.
So thank you for all the points, Ruda. I just want to say your questions are, as always, on point. The argument that I'm discussing is actually one of the different argumentative strategies that Ankaravi uses. So he does actually, and especially when I show the manuscript that was sent to a mosque preacher, that was written in a very much sort of legal hadith tradition. So he does employ multiple discourses. And this treatise, for instance, has not been studied because it's not one of the sort of most easily written. It has lengthy quotations, from Arabic sources, from Persian sources. So it is clearly written for a more limited audience. When I said in the beginning, there is a legalistic vein and there is a Persianate vein, I was trying to sort of acknowledge this. But I also do not really want to sort of fall back into this idea of this is Persian, it must only be the elite, although of course we should take note of the fact that, as I said in the earlier, there is a connection between being urban and speaking Persian that also pops up in these sources. So there is an element of social relevance there. The reason I'm not talking about that is that I haven't been able to put my finger on that very well yet. I can identify a few groups who are more drawn to this sort of argument, mainly the secretaries. So I don't know really, but I don't want to sort of go back to that idea that, you know, that this is a very much elite argument. And that's one of the reasons I started reading these Sema treatises more closely, because the Sema ceremonies are some of the places that these notions are very much communicated in a more simple manner. And that's why I like to speak about those Mevlevi stories about sort of the book being Revelation, for instance. If you read that from Ankarevi, it's very complicated. He uses Ishrakism. It's very philosophically, you know, heavily justified. But in fact, you have this miniature which actually puts the same idea in much simpler terms. So I try to think about the performance context a little bit to sort of really make sure that I'm not making an assumption there. But it's a good question, and how these different modes of discussion relate. The thing about Kızılbaş books is that it really is not about Shiism, because these people who are being blamed for teaching Shiism, I mean, they are very well-known figures. They are very close to the imperial center. Their Naqshbandi Bekri silsiles is something, and there's actually a very clear reference to what exactly they are teaching. So I do think, I mean, from the way that I read these things, it's more about the sort of philosophical vein of argument that follows from this book rather than Shiism. Of course, I have a question mark next to that, but I haven't seen that blatant criticism against any of these people anyway, and they do stay very much in the mainstream. So have I skipped anything? Thank you so much for the questions.
I think the class aspect.
Yeah, the class aspect, I said I can't put my finger on it. Okay. But I'm trying not to go with these assumptions that we usually have about Persian sources.
Would you mind, Professor Abisa, to take your question or comment later? And this is how we usually proceed in the, or just want to respond? Okay.
Yeah, we can take one question.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not gonna ask another question. What I meant about the Kızılbaş being a reference to Shiism is not that they actually are dealing with Shiism, but it is a discourse of Shiitization. It's
right.
It's an accusation of something that is not accurate.
No, so, that I definitely agreed with. I try to sort of acknowledge that that's definitely true, and it's one of the things Ankarevi also responds to and says, you know, we are being blamed for being alid, but let me explain. So it's that sort of argument, but it's not. I mean, the people who use the argument don't mean that these people are Shiites, but it's just a way of putting the respondent down, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Rula.
Thank you.
And there's another question. And for those of you who are interested in asking a question, would you mind using the chat option that we gather the questions, then I will relate them to the speaker. So the Zeynep Uslu has a question that she's asking whether are there theoretical discussions on the notion and role of poetry in this anti-Puritan literature?
So there are. So for instance, when Ankarevi says, Mesnevi is what makes this a language of heaven, then there is a whole discussion on how poetry is hikmeh, or part of poetry is hikmeh, or philosophical mysticism. And the sort of clearest expressions are in Sheikh Galib, and Holbrook actually notes these instances where Sheikh Galib says, if it weren't for poetry, nobody would have understood the Quran. So this kind of literature on poetry as a science, and poetry having this sort of exalted place is part of that discussion. Thank you for the question, Zeynep.
And I think we are abusing your position as the host, and Derin Terzioğlu has a question. And thank you, Aslan, for a very inspiring talk. And she is very much convinced by your argument that there was a connected, collective Ottoman anti-Puritan literature, which transcends tariqat differences. But her sense is that this literature, this kind of connected, collective response, emerges only in the late 17th century. And your talk made me realize that this trend becomes even stronger in the 18th century. And she would like to hear your thoughts about why sheikhs of different orders began to stand up for one another from the late 17th century onwards.
So that's a good question. And I do agree that there is a major change after 1680s, not only most of the things that I called the afterlife of the Puritan debates, what made me think about, let's think about this, as people setting the paradigm rather than, discussing the specific event, is that there is not only more, but it's also more explicit. For instance, with Ankarevi, I'm having a hard time finding who he is arguing against. I mean, he's always just anonymizing. Nablusi is mostly the same. Only when I come to later commentaries like Müstakimzadeh, then I can find names and texts that I can actually follow. So the amount of literature is different. The type of literature is different. So why different orders are standing for each other is a good question. I have one tentative answer to this, which is that we have many people like Müstakimzadeh who is writing for the Mevlevis and Melamis and Naqshbandis. We have Mevlevi, Naqshbandi, Halveti combination. One possibility is, and I think this is something that Rashida Sheikh talks about in relation to Sufism in Egypt, is that Sufism becomes not so much tied to genealogies and institutions, but it becomes part of a more individualized practice of moral formation. So in a way, these genealogies start to matter a little bit less. That's why we can see these cross-pollinations. Anyways, I have some more thoughts on this, but my tentative answer is that the nature of Sufism is changing towards this sort of more individualized understanding, because before the 18th century, most of the Mevlevi arguments are genealogical. They'll say, the descendants of Rumi do this. It's a tradition because the descendants of Rumi do this. And this sort of genealogical argument sort of gradually disappears in the 18th century. So that would be my tentative answer, but thank you for the question.
Thank you. Are there any questions that you would like to? Because I saw a hand, a couple of hands. Yes. If you have difficulty in using the chat box, maybe you can ask your question directly. Yep. Sorry, I cannot see the full name of yours on my small box, that's why.
Okay, hi. Hi, so I just asked my question as well. Thank you so much for such a rich, thought-provoking talk. And it's just kind of just a reflection. Maybe there's a question, maybe not. But it strikes me that the emergence of what we might today call literary criticism in Persian, Turkish, at least Persian and Turkish, is roughly contemporary. across the Mughal, Safavid, and Turkish Ottoman empires, perhaps about 70, 80 years earlier in the Ottoman Empire and Turkish, you think of, Sudi Busnavi and so forth, Shem'i and those commentators. And it strikes me that what the phenomenon you're talking about, this sort of, you're connecting allegorical interpretation of poetry with some kind of, sort of state religion and sort of a civic religion as well, right? And opposed to that is a kind of literalism, calling Puritan. I'm wondering, I mean, maybe there's a question here. I mean, would this entire phenomenon be sort of an extension of Max Weber's genealogy of modern selfhood in a certain kind of Protestant genealogy of modern individualism, right? Which he hadn't originally applied to the Ottoman Empire at all. For him, it was an Occidental self. That's what he calls essays on, the rest of the world outside of Europe. But the argument you're making as a whole could be read, especially since the category Puritanism is central to your argument, right? Which is, are we speaking of a kind of Islamic Protestantism, right? Which allows for a kind of individual individualization of religiosity, of piety across the modern world. And is that why, allegory, Ta'wil is so important, in the Mughal, Safavid, and because one could argue it could have emerged much earlier, especially because of Shi'ism, because Imami exegesis, which already with Imam Jafar is, has a putatively allegorical origin, and yet it doesn't really emerge robustly until Davani and post Davani, right? And the importance of Davani for Safavid. So anyway, this is my question. Maybe there's no just to reflect. Thank you for your talk.
There are multiple efforts to sort of actually reconcile. There are people who will be talking about this very excitedly here in the audience, reconcile or at least measure Weber's theory against the Ottoman case. I will speak a bit more cautiously because I haven't thought about this at length. But what happens in the early 17th century is sort of a pull between like a more communal way of thinking, like Taife way of thinking, Taife autonomy versus every individual is measured against a set standard. This is what Sunni Islam is, and this is how it is. So there is that tendency, and I do think it's two different forms of governmentality, at least, that are fighting here, and then they also correspond to two different forms of self-formation. I'm not sure about the value of Weber's thought in that. I don't know. I haven't thought about that yet, but there is definitely those trends. And the way allegorical interpretation, I very much like to talk about to you at length, is for me, it does allow for these communal differences or communal autonomies that is not a space that's so much allowed by the more juridical discourse. So it is defended because it has a social function in that, in creating these sort of spaces. So there is definitely those connections between governmentality and this interpretation, but I can only be this much articulate for now, sorry. Thank you for the question.
So Aslan, if you have energy and time I'm asking the rest of the audience, we have at least two more questions. And the first one is from Dr. Betül Yavuz. She's thanking you for the stimulating talk. And she's saying that she is wondering if this reaction to Persian as the language of hell was a reaction towards, not just towards poetry, but also to late medieval groups that had developed a sophisticated system of cosmology on being Persian as being more advanced language than Arabic and the language of the New Age, and Hurufis specifically.
I haven't thought about the Hurufis, but there is something to be said about the coupling of this sort of poetry with philosophy, especially in the Ishraqi case. So this coupling is actually what enables someone like Ankaravi to make larger claims about where the place of Sharia is, say, within the canvas. of the science of afterlife. I'm not sure about the Hurufis, mainly because one of the things that the Mevlevis are simultaneously trying to do, and it's very obvious in the early 18th century source I talked about, is to break away from this late medieval history, which is more complicated actually than they are making out in the early modern period. I think I mentioned that sort of the more Shiite elements are weeded out. In the late medieval period, there are direct criticisms of the Mevlevi organization being run by a familiar hereditary sort of lineage, for instance, and there is direct criticism to this hereditary application or the general structure whereby the family has the final say in most things. So the late medieval period, from the Mevlevi perspective, is something that is being played down a little bit in this period. So I haven't thought about that, but I'd be happy to hear if there's specific, Hurufi texts or ideas you're talking about. It's an interesting thought. Thank you.
And I said 2 questions, but this one has 3 parts.
Okay.
And Derin Terzioğlu is asking, and she is also fascinated by the discussion about Sulhidin and would like to know more about A, who other than Tokadi uses the concept of Sulhidin. B, in what kinds of texts or discourses does it come up? And C, are there any clues in these texts that the writers were familiar with the discussions about Sulhidin, Sulhikul in the Mughal context?
Yes, so I want to start with the last one. I really looked into that. I haven't seen anything. Of course, the place to look for that is to actually look at this translation of Sirhindi's Mektubat into Turkish and to see how it's translated. But I haven't seen, there are genealogies and silsilas that go back to Sirhindi, the Mughal context, but I haven't seen direct references to the practice in Mughal India. As for Sulhidin, the specific term is very much an 18th century term. I don't see Sulhidin in Nablusi or Ankaravi or some of the 17th century figures. But what I see in them is this discourse of tenafur club, against which the community should stop following the principle of commanding the right and forbidding the wrong. So the related sort of discourse of a social tension and the solution being to sort of ease up the sort of social pressure, at least, on Islamic practice. And that's those parallels of tashdid and tanazur, those vocabulary is something that I find parallel, by which I tie sulhikul. But definitely as a term, as it is, it's a very 18th century term. And I'm also hoping to find more about how it changes from the Mughal context, because that's, I think, one of the things that Sirhindi's thought is later very much revised by some of his disciples, and we don't know how it came to the Ottoman Istanbul context.
And we have one last question. You can keep the answer short if you are run out of energy, Aslıhan. And Professor Faruk Marvasti is asking about the position of Mesnevi and Rumi, that was Mesnevi and Rumi found in the 15th, 16th century by the officials in the Ottoman Empire?
I haven't seen any such notes. To the contrary, 15th, 16th century. No, I haven't seen anything. But one thing I can say is that something we should watch out is that reverence for the Mesnevi is not the same as reverence for the Mevlevis and the Çelebi's. There are periods of out-and-out conflict with the Çelebi's and the Sultan, but even though in those periods, the Mesnevi itself as a text is very much revered. The issue here is that we need to understand, and I should maybe emphasize this, my interpretation is what I'm presenting here is the Mevlevi interpretation of what the Mesnevi is. There are much more down-to-earth commentaries on the Mesnevi. For instance, the late 16th century Shami Effendi, his commentary is very much, how can I say, I don't know, it doesn't have these connotations of divine revelation, and it is much more down-to-earth. It does read like a, level-headed sort of moral guide. And this is why I was thinking along those lines of, is it the text of the Mesnevi or is it the way the Mesnevi is read? And I think there are ways in which the Mesnevi is read that are very different from what I'm arguing, thanks to which the book has always had this very much central place to the extent that I can see in the center.
Thank you. I think that was all for today, and I would like to thank Aslıhan once again for this stimulating lecture, and also the audience for this fruitful discussion. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I just want to leave you free with one reminder that on the 28th of May, we will host Cemal Kafadar, and the last speaker of the series of Nafi Baba lectures. Okay, so see you in about 1 month time. İyi eve kapanmalar, and take care. Okay, thank you Aslıhan once again.
Thank you for everything to everyone.